Very good. Bob, just come on up here. Mr. Bob Rosner, one of our regular members here, is going to do the honors in introducing our main program today. FYI, Bob is going to be going to New York City to appear on CBS Morning News this Saturday to talk about, well, surviving the holiday party. So I was kind of curious what makes you such an expert, Bob, but maybe that's another warm-up program. But Bob, thanks a lot for helping putting on the program today. It took a lot of work. There were a couple little moving parts that the program committee and myself and Sue had to deal with, and Bob really helped us out. So thank you so much, Bob. And please do the introduction.
Thanks. So, what is my favorite part of Rotary? Is it the fellowship? Not really. Is it the programs? Not so much. The service? No. My favorite part of the program is when I learn a fact from this podium that allows me to win a bar bet. Now, today's winner is Clinton Robert Douglas. C.R. Douglas. C.R.'s family has long roots in Seattle. His great-uncle had the original lease on the Metropolitan Tract, now run by Unico. C.R. has built a 4-Emmy media dynasty from the most auspicious beginnings, public access TV. It's fascinating for me to watch CR operate at Q13, where we both work. There was an editorial meeting, and the news director said, well, we should get a comment from the governor. And people said, well, we tried that before, it's never worked. CR not only got the governor, but he got the governor to come to the studios in Seattle to be interviewed. It's amazing to watch him work. He once asked Colin Powell, General Colin Powell, weren't you supposed to be the first black president? Powell was not entertained by the question. But Clinton Robert knows how to ask the questions that entertain and inform the rest of us. C.R. Douglas.
So note to self, do not disagree with your news director. I am 4 weeks in this sling. During this past election, there was this up to now unknown guy named Nate Silver. He's not really a household name. He certainly wasn't before this election, but he was certainly known in at least one household in every neighborhood. He's that New York Times blogger. You probably heard him. You might have seen him interviewed. He correctly predicted all 50 states for this presidential election. And in 2008, he predicted 49 of the 50 states. And there were well-known people who clearly didn't get it right. Nate Silver was one of the brilliant people that got it right. Matt Barreto is our Nate Silver. He is a professor of political science at the University of Washington and in charge of their nonpartisan-based Washington poll. He's accumulated this amazing track record, like Nate Silver, with getting pre-election polling right. Consider his track record on the eve of this November election. That Friday before we voted, the Washington poll, led by Barreto, said that Inslee would win by 3.1%. Inslee won by 3.08%. In 2010, when Senator Murray was running against Dino Rossi, the Washington poll, right in the eve of the election, had her beating Dino by 4 percentage points. She won by 4.7%. And in 2008, when Gregoire was running for re-election, the Washington poll showed a 2-point margin of victory. She won by 1.9%. Matt knows how to do this stuff. And everyone in the business, I can tell you, listens to what the Washington poll is about. You know, it's part art, it's part science. Yes, you need to know a lot of statistics. Yes, you need to have that background in social science. But you also have to have good hunches. And Matt brings a bunch of good hunches to this work. He's also known in national circles as well. He is one of the most respected, runs one of the most respected Latino polling firms, Latino Decisions. He played an active role nationally in this election with that enterprise. Indeed, he has been to the White House several times since 2008 when Obama was elected, sharing his understanding with them, the president and his advisors, of the ever-growing Latino vote. He is here today to make sense of what happened in this election. Please give him a round of applause. So how do you do it? What is your polling methodology that gets it so right?
Well, I should say after that stirring introduction that I'm sad that we are a nonprofit polling organization at the UW, because I think I could put that on business cards and try to make some money like Nate Silver does. But, one of the things that we do at UW with the Washington poll, focusing here on Washington State, is that we bring a heavy dose of social science to polling. And I think a lot of the other pollsters that are in the business are good at what they do, but they're always concerned about the next project, moving on to the next survey that they need to do, and there's not quite as much effort. We have the luxury of having time to go slow, to plan the methodology, to plan for this poll. We only do polling during the month of October, right before the election. And so we put a lot of effort and energy to making sure the sample is right and that we hit all of the appropriate markers.
So the nonprofit aspect of it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, it's run through the university. We get that backing. I work with a great team of other faculty who lend their expertise, and also a team of graduate students, PhD students, who are pushing and writing. And hopefully one of the things we'll talk about if we talk about Referendum 74 is that I have a graduate student who's spent the last 4 years researching and writing why attitudes towards gays and lesbians are sort of hard to predict. And this year, she created a model that adjusted the data, and she predicted that Referendum 74 would pass by 6.5%, and it passed by 7.4%. So we do a lot of this stuff. It's something, as I said, she's been working on for 4 years. Other pollsters don't have that luxury of telling someone, go work on a project for 4 years and then report back to me when there happens to be an initiative on that. And so we leverage a lot of the expertise, I think, at UW.
Is the art, we all want to talk about the governor's race, among others, but is the art trying to figure out who the likely voters are?
Yeah, no, I mean,
or is it getting your sample right so that you're sampling enough Democrats and Republicans to make it accurate? What's the harder part?
I think in a state like Washington, where we don't have partisan registration, getting the appropriate number of D's and R's in your sample is critical, and it's hard. We don't know. Normally, we can look at the data and say, we have 20% of all of our voters are between the ages of 39 and 55. Well, according to the voter registration records, which knows everyone's age, it should be 23%. So we can adjust that. There's no official record of how many people are Democrats and how many people are Republicans. And as we all know, that is the closest thing that predicts your vote. And some of the other polls that were done in the state that said it was a tie or showed, there was a couple other polls that showed right in the last few weeks that McKinnon was ahead. If you look at their numbers, they just had slightly too many Republicans or not enough Democrats. So that here is the biggest trick, and it's something that's very, very difficult. And we look every year to try to make sure that we're reading the tea leaves and seeing where are the trends going in Washington State. So if we had adjusted our partisanship numbers, our poll would not have said 3.1%. It might have said that Inslee was up by 6 or that it was a virtual tie. And so getting those right is a real, real trick.
The McKenna people, they feel like they were going to win by 3 points, something like that on Election Day. I mean, they were quite confident. They had, good science, a lot of high-paid people, I'm sure. What were they getting wrong?
One of the things, and we exchanged some emails with them, one of the things that we do for anyone who's interested is that because we do the poll out of UW, which is a public entity, we field emails from everyone and send data back. So we had lots of email exchanges with both the McKenna people and the Inslee people in the first few waves. Could we see some more breakouts in this region or this age group, just to sort of see what we were doing? And we always supply those. They were convinced that the electorate, and this was sort of part of the national story, they were convinced that the electorate here in Washington State would look more like the electorate in 2010, our most recent big statewide election.
Which was a red wave.
Which was a big wave for conservatives, for Tea Party supporters, and they thought that that might continue, that there was still some of that frustration was lingering, and that would show up. Those folks who showed up in 2010 to elect a lot of Republicans would show up again in those record numbers to send a message to the president. They knew all along that Obama would carry the state, but I think they thought that and so I think their numbers were off. When they would tell us, and we would have confidential discussions with a lot of different folks, they would say, well, we're only seeing 32% Democrat. Why are you guys putting it at 35? And we would have these sort of discussions with them, and in the end, again, you have to sort of look at the trends. And what we did was we went back and looked at every presidential election, because we know from a lot of the political science literature and things we study, in presidential years you get a different electorate. We also had these discussions with them that we tried to convince them of, and I talked about this a lot in the press early on, that the marriage initiative and the pot initiative, that would just slightly, not have a huge effect, but it would slightly bring out a different subset of voters that weren't so interested in 2010. People who were coming out, they would be slightly younger, they would be slightly more progressive, and they were not, I think, seeing some of those trends.
You made what turned out to be a very prophetic call, basically on election night or the morning after, where the McKenna folks were saying, hey, hold tight, be patient. He said that to his supporters that night. As the week goes on, it'll get better for us and we will prevail. Obviously, that didn't happen. You said it wouldn't, and you were right. What were they basing it on? And what do we know about sort of late ballots that are counted versus earlies and the trends in Washington?
That's another really hard thing to think about in polling in Washington State, because when we're in the field polling, some of those people we're talking to, they've already voted. So it's sort of like an exit poll. Even though it's a week before the election, they've already sent in their ballot. And we broke those out. And in fact, they were referring to part of our data when they were making those claims, because we showed that the people who told us, I've already sent my ballot in, they were breaking for Inslee at about +5. And the people who had not yet sent their ballot in were only about +1 or 2.
Which is what gave the McKenna folks hope.
They had hope, but they had hope, and I don't know where the hope came from, but they had hope that the late deciders were not just breaking +1 for Inslee, because if the early deciders were breaking +5, the late deciders needed to be breaking like +4 for McKenna just to sort of get it back to a tie. And I think they were misreading. They had a lot of their own internal polling that they claimed was showing that undecideds were really going to break heavily. And there just weren't a lot of undecideds this year also. It was a big sort of debate that a lot of people sort of knew where they were. I don't know. I don't know where they had those numbers from. What we based it on was the King County vote. And that's something that I think every year, it's not that hard to do these predictions and estimates that we do. Every year on election night, when that first wave of data comes out, we put out forecasts. We did it in the referendum 71 debate that people were sort of afraid to call the first few nights and ended up winning by 6. And if you look at King County and how that's trending, you can almost, except for on the charter schools amendment, you can almost predict how the final vote will go on all of these contests.
And you did, in fact, you've done that in years past. I mean, you were able to say, and am I right that we used to have this sense that like people who voted early might be more partisan, maybe more Democrat, maybe more Republican, and that late ballots will be different. But are we finding that you take a batch on any given day and it's going to be the same?
We're seeing a lot more consistency. What we can do is take the ballots, and the Secretary of States and all the county registrars, they provide this data to us, to everyone. It's on their website on a daily basis. You just have to go through the effort of every day going back in, Wednesday, the day after the election, downloading the Wednesday dump, Thursday, 2 days after, downloading the Thursday dump, and you can see how it breaks. There is slight changes, but it doesn't fluctuate that much. The difference between early deciders and late deciders end up just being people's busy lives. They're not huge differences. There used to be, when we had polling places, that people who went to the polls, people who got mobilized to go vote on election day, were a little bit more Democratic leaning, and that they were suspect and that they were responding to a lot of the get out the vote drives that Democrats were a little bit better at, and that early voters tended to be people who were a little bit higher income, who might be traveling and out of the state on election day, and they tended to be. Those differences are largely gone. We usually don't see much, and that's why I say if you look at King County and you say King County has the most votes. And the other thing to remember, and this is what people forget, King County has the most votes left to count. And I think people forget that. In the small counties in central and eastern Washington, they can count about 2/3 of their ballots by election night because there are not that many votes to count. And so those are places where Republicans tend to do better. So the election night forecast almost always overstates the Republican preference. We went back and looked at governor, Senate, even some initiatives. And the Democratic preference entirely not because preferences change and people say, oh, the late deciders. No, those votes were already sitting at the King County office. They have like 900,000 ballots to count. That takes them.
So as those get counted,
it takes them almost a full week, and all the other counties can sort of say like, hey, we're done. And then you still have 200,000 Democratic votes sitting in King County to count.
Is Jay Inslee governor because of gay marriage and pot?
I think those were part of the story. He ended up winning by 3.1, as we said, and so it probably wasn't enough to provide the difference. We've been looking at where those might have elevated turnout for young people and some progressives. Probably wasn't enough to make the difference. Had it been a little bit closer, that might have been the case. But those were certainly working against McKenna, I think, from the start. And that's something that they didn't want to acknowledge. They didn't believe that this would create any problems for them. Those were historic initiatives. For people who really cared about those initiatives, who thought that they were interesting, it added a little bit of spark to their decision to vote. And there wasn't something similar. 1185, the tax initiative that might be a little bit of a spark on the right to conservatives, we have voted on that literally like 4 years in a row. And so it wasn't new. Everyone knew it was going to pass. And so there wasn't that balance. And so I think it did add to the equation. It probably wasn't the difference maker. And it was something that, if the McKinnon people look back, they may have tried to engage those two initiatives a bit differently. They should have.
The Latino vote obviously was huge in a lot of the swing states for the presidential race. How important was the Latino vote in the governor's race?
You know, here in Washington State, it's growing very, very quickly. And the population of citizen-eligible Hispanics and Asian Americans is growing very quickly. That's driving. The reason that we have that extra congressional district is entirely due to the population growth of Hispanics and Asians. If that growth hadn't happened, we would not have had that extra district, which opens up a whole nother debate about how that district ended up getting drawn and who that district actually represents, that I think is very, very troubling. But those populations are growing, and in this case, I think if you combine the vote of Hispanics and Asian Americans who showed the strongest preference in both groups, the strongest preference we have ever seen for Democratic candidates, those were enough to provide the margin in a close election for someone like Inslee. And I think that that's something that as we move forward in Washington state politics, there'll be a lot more attention on that. Right now, it was sort of like the eye-opener, that these populations are growing together. They might make up 11, 12% of the electorate. So those elections that are getting decided by 2, 3, 4 points, you really have to have a smart strategy on getting out the minority vote.
And why, McKenna has outreach quite a bit to those communities. I mean, certainly the Latino community, other communities. I've heard a lot of good sort of things about his access and stuff. Why didn't they respond to him?
I think part of it was, he did even spoke in some extremely accented Spanish at one of the debates in Yakima at the opening of the debate. And I think that part of it was the national image. The Republican Party was really in free fall with Latino voters nationally. You go back to the primary. It was a very bruising primary for those Republican candidates, beating each other up over who was the most anti-immigrant, who was going to make English the official language first, who was going to deny benefits to even repealing the 14th Amendment of the Constitution to take away citizenship rights of kids who were born here if their parents weren't citizens. And that created a big cloud over the Republican Party. And so I think that as that was covered and as that was discussed and filtered down into the community, there was just almost an obstacle to just voting Republican. I think we saw that McKenna may have outperformed the national averages, the numbers that Romney got certainly and others. But again, I think there was some outreach, but I don't think it was really concentrated. I don't think Inslee necessarily did a great job. I think Inslee benefited from a national climate in which Latinos and Asians voted overwhelmingly Democratic this year. But I think it's a message to both candidates. Had McKenna done a little bit more, maybe bought a lot of ads in Spanish, TV and radio, there's a lot of markets here where he could have been doing that. distinguishing himself from Romney and others on these issues, he may have been able to get some of that vote back, and that may have brought it down to 1% or.
What do you make of there were two pretty moderate Republicans on the ballot, Reagan Dunn and Bill Finkbeiner, both support same-sex marriage, both are pro-choice Republicans, and they got slaughtered. I mean, the social issues they were in step, if you will, with kind of blue Washington, and that didn't help them.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult. I think there was an article in the Times. I think Jim Bruner wrote a piece that said there's only one Republican, Kim Wyman, elected to statewide office now, the entire West Coast, not Washington State, Washington, Oregon, and California. One. And that election was very close. It wasn't like a runaway. And I think that's, again, it's the brand. It's branding. It's the image. It's a very hard sell in a state in which the Democratic Senate candidate wins by over 20 points. And that the Democratic presidential candidate wins by 14 points, for those down-ballot candidates to differentiate themselves. So you have voters who are saying by 55 and 60% margins, we support Democrats. And then on the gubernatorial race, which is extremely partisan, giving a narrow victory there, it's very difficult for those down-ticket candidates who are not getting nearly as much attention, there's not nearly as much commercials, for voters to differentiate and say, at that point, we find the research very clear. People then, if you pulled the trigger for Inslee, probably the rest of the candidates on the ballot that you're not sure about, you don't know really where they stand on all these issues, what sort of AG or Secretary of State or auditor are they going to be, you just then vote the way that you did on governor. And so until the Republicans can get a competitive gubernatorial candidate,
those down ballots
just go the same way.
How is it harder to pull candidates or issues?
Oh, issues. There's no doubt.
How come?
Issues don't have that partisan allegiance. We all know, going into the re-election campaign for Inslee in 2016 about where 93% of the voters are right now, because we know what their partisan allegiances are. It's unlikely that people who consider themselves Democrats, when we ask them, will vote against Inslee in his reelection. And it's unlikely that people who say, no, I'm definitely a Republican, would vote for him. And then we can figure out on issues, all bets are off. You have to look at the issue. There's not, 30 years of history of you've always voted this way on this issue. They come and go from one cycle to the next. And sometimes they have confusing endorsers. So sometimes you have conservative and liberal groups working together to support an issue or to oppose it. We saw that in the liquor initiatives in the consecutive years, and we saw that in the marijuana initiative this year. And so there's a lot messier cues. And then you have the commercials. And the job of the commercials is to come in and make it messier. The job of the commercials is not at all to give you the straight opinion or information about these initiatives. There's no question about that. That is not what they're attempting to do. They're attempting to introduce more confusion so that you might think, oh, that sounds reasonable. And so initiatives are historically very, very hard to pull on.
How much do people lie?
In the poll?
Yeah.
So one of the questions we have now on our poll, and we started this in 2009 after we polled on Referendum 71, and this is what...
That's the domestic partnership.
This was the domestic partnership initiative in 2009, in which not just our poll, but a number of other polls statewide that year suggested that it would win maybe by 12 or 13 points. And I think we had it up by 15 in our final numbers, and it won by 6.5. And after that, we thought, how is that possible? Because on some of the other issues and the candidates were getting it exactly right. So it's not our sample. What's happening there? And we have a bunch of 18 to 22-year-old college students who are calling and maybe eliciting some what we call social desirability. That when they call someone up and say, what do you think about gay people? Someone's first answer isn't to say, oh, they should not have equal rights. There's some hesitancy for some people, not all. So if we were off by about 7 or 8 points that year, and so we add a question out at the end of our poll. This is a little secret. We get done and we say, okay, now the survey is over, which it is. We've asked them all their questions. Our surveys last like 25 minutes. We take them through a battery of every item, policy issues, not just the votes, all sorts of other issues. We ask them about race, religion, all sorts of things. And we say, did any of the topics we covered in this poll, did any of them make you feel uncomfortable, that you weren't happy that we were asking you, your opinion on should a mosque be built in your neighborhood? And people say yes, they'll tell us. And we say, which issues? And again, we tell them, the poll's over, you're sort of off the record now, this is sort of the post-interview. And then we followed up with an additional question, which we couldn't find any companion to this in any public opinion survey, academic, for-profit, private, where we say, at any point in this survey, did you not give me your full, honest opinion as though you were talking to your best friend or your brother or sister? Was there ever a time where you maybe weren't 100% honest with us? And it's nice to ask them afterwards because they've already given us their opinion. We're not going to go back and change anything. And we get about 15% of people who admit that maybe once they may not have been 100% honest. We couple their response there with the response on the previous question of which topics did you not like? And that's what allowed us to do that along with other things.
Sneaky.
We say people who are born-again Christians, go to church every Sunday, say religion is very important in their life, and then they told us they were going to vote yes on referendum 74. We don't necessarily believe that's true, and we can look at these other answers and say, these are people who were a little bit uncomfortable. They didn't want to say that, but we can sort of then predict through some statistical models, and that's what my student did. She put those people back in, and her adjusted model had that referendum 74. On the partisan stuff, it's less likely. People will tell you, I'm voting for Inslee, I'm voting for McKenna. They're not. But on some of these other issues, do you support the legalization of drugs? Do you support same-sex marriage? There is some what we call social desirability.
And briefly, I want to ask you about the White House and President Obama. Do you guys do cell phones? I mean, it's all in-person interviews, and you do cell phones.
Yeah, so what it is we have a lab there at the University of Washington in the political science department. It looks like a computer lab during the day. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, students come in, put headsets on, and it turns into a calling center. We call landlines and cell phones. We make sure we have the appropriate mix of those. You can get sort of information and data on what percentage of households are cell phone only, and that's very, very critical. And again, we take these extra steps of making sure we have the exact right percentage of people under the age of 30, of people over the age of 70. We have the exact proportion of people who are registered voters in King County, people who are in Yakima and Spokane, and we take all those extra steps afterwards. They don't naturally come in. People in King County might be slightly more likely to take the survey coming from students at UW. So if we got 55% of our respondents from the Puget Sound 4-county region, and it should be 52, we weight them down because we don't want to have it overrepresented. And so we take a lot of extra steps. There's almost a full day after the survey is done where we go through and weight it. And we think that's what gives us that little extra reliability. Okay,
you go to the White House. You have all these meetings. I don't know if Obama was in them. Who was? What did they ask him? What did you tell him?
Okay, so I can talk about some of it. I can't talk about others, but I'll tell you one funny story as a prelude. The first time I got invited to a social event after we went and did a couple of meetings in 2009 and 2010 to brief folks there on policy, where Latinos were on the issues. They have to always be policy meetings. If you ever say something about the election or vote or something like that, they all start shutting you down because you can't have those meetings about elections in the West Wing. But we did a couple of meetings. My research partner, Gary Segura, who used to be a professor at UW, is a professor at Stanford. And then we got invited to the Cinco de Mayo party at the White House. And we thought, this will be fun, a social occasion. It was in the Rose Garden. We went. You have to fill out this paperwork ahead of time to make sure you're going through. The short version of the story is I was there with my wife, who had an extremely expensive dress that she had bought just for the occasion. And I was listed as a, quote, do not admit, because I had a warrant for my arrest in the state of New Mexico from a unpaid speeding ticket when I was in college.
Wow.
And so it would have been the first time that I actually was at an event with the president. And we waited around for a while. And after about 30 minutes, my wife looked at me and said, well, I'm going in.
I bought that dress. I'm going to get something out of it.
Right. And so I stayed there for a while afterwards, and in that instance, I never actually got to go in. They said that this was right after. I know people remember right after the president won. There was these party crashers. You remember that? Like 4 years ago, these people from Virginia who had reality show. They got in, so they cracked down on security after that, and I was sort of one of the casualties of that. And so immediately the next day, I paid my speeding ticket in New Mexico. which was it was like $84. It wasn't that much. They had not put any interest or anything on it. And we got to go back on a couple of other occasions, and in fact, we'll be going to one of the holiday parties in about 2 weeks. The first year we got invited to one of the holiday parties, we were very excited until we learned that there are literally 2 a day. Almost the entire month of December, and so it's not that special to go. But we talk about policy. Where are Latino voters on the issues? What do they want to see? I think that the Office of Public Engagement has been very open to hearing from a variety of groups on a variety of issues, just to sort of get more information of the community. A lot of people are there to complain about policy. Look, this is a constituency group that voted for you. Why are we seeing these policies enacted? And that's something that previous White Houses had not been quite as open to. They sort of were resistant. They don't want to have people coming in here and yelling at them. And so a lot of the briefings you end up doing is you're trying to push and say, this is where opinion is on this. This is where people expect to see. And then they'll give you, sort of the realities of, working with Congress. We did that for a number of years. The response we always got when we were talking about immigration reform was, the president can't do it by himself. He has to deal with Congress. And lo and behold, finally, we certainly weren't the only ones involved. There's a huge coalition of immigration groups. Lo and behold, June 15th, 2012, the president stands up and announces an executive order that he's bypassing Congress, and he is going to do it himself, and to give what is now called the deferred action, that they will not issue any deportation proceedings against the so-called dreamers, the students who are here undocumented.
Just about a minute left, but was it information you gave them that helped move him into that decision?
We had worked on this for a long time, since pretty much 08 or 09. So we'd been working on that for a long time with some advocacy groups. And we actually were fielding a survey in June that was to be providing cover to the president. If you go back and search in the records right after the June 15th announcement, we released a survey on MSNBC 2 days afterwards explaining that this received 90% approval from Hispanic voters. And so we actually started the survey.
30 seconds.
We started the survey a week before the announcement because someone had told us, the announcement's coming on June 15th, so read this to voters and see how they respond, because they want to have that cover right after they announce it to say, quote, this was the right thing to do. And that's a sort of a common thing. That was something that didn't just come out of one poll. It came out of 3 or 4 years of work.
Wow, Matt Barreto, political science professor at the University of Washington, the Washington poll, you were great. Thank you.
Seattle Rotary Online is made possible in part by a grant from First Choice Health, working with the Washington Health Information Collaborative to use technology to bring better health care to patients throughout the Pacific Northwest. First Choice Health.